Andrew Roberts, welcome to the Inquiring Mind Podcast.
Thank you very much indeed, Stanley. It's a great honor to be on your show.
The honor is all mine. When I reached out to you, I said that a few years back, before this whole pandemic thing, I went to a talk where you were promoting your new book at the time about Churchill, which was a fantastic book. For those that did not read it, they should. And you signed my book. We had probably a 15-second interaction, and it was a pleasure. And now I get to talk to you, as if I'm one of the hosts of the 92nd Street YMCA in New York. So, you wrote a new book. It's another tome. I feel like I have a Andrew Roberts brick collection in my on my bookshelf, which I love, and it's about it's about King George III, and it's called The Last King of America. Can you tell me why you decided to write this book?
Yes, thank you, Stanley. It's really that we know three things about George III: that he had porphyria, this terrible blood disorder which sent him mad, and that he was because he was mad and because he was obstinate, we the British lost the American colonies, and that we deserve to, because George III was a tyrant. And we know that from the Declaration of Independence and also from Hamilton the musical. But in fact, all three of those things are completely wrong. He didn't have porphyria. He suffered from manic depression. In fact, the affective type 1 of bipolar disorder. And it had nothing to do with losing the American colonies, because the major outbreak didn't actually happen until 5 years after America became independent. And he certainly was not a tyrant either. He was an Enlightenment monarch who had a veneration for the limited constitution that we had in Britain. And America was ready for independence by the 1770s, and it had 2.5 million population, and it had a burgeoning economy and as many bookshops in Philadelphia as in any other city of the empire apart from London. But so it was right that America should become independent, but that did not mean that George III was a tyrant.
Mm-hmm. And why, after writing about people like world leaders like Napoleon and Churchill, did you decide that King George III was the next biography that you wanted to write? What was the spark, you would call it?
Well, it was very much this sense that he was being wildly traduced. The musical Hamilton, which is tremendous fun, and my toes tapped as much as everybody else's, actually does depict him as an evil and sinister figure, as well as being sort of camp and so on. And he was none of those things. And having written about Napoleon, who of course was Emperor of France whilst the king was King of England, I did have a strong sense of George III, and there are lots of controversies around George III, and I thought that I had something new to say. But the really key thing was that the Queen in 2015, Her Majesty the Queen, put 100,000 pages of George III's private papers, his memoranda and his correspondence and his archives and so on, into the public domain, and that suddenly, especially of course during lockdown, made it an awful lot easier for somebody who goes to the Royal Archives but wasn't able to go there for 18 months to research this book.
Yeah, in the musical Hamilton you just alluded to, there's a lyric about and I'm going to paraphrase obviously, where King George III is singing, and he's kind of this almost bipolar character where he's like, very joyous. And then all of a sudden he's like, I'm going to send an armed battalion to remind you of my love. And you argue that that's completely wrong. But where does that idea, where did that come from? And why is it that it took this long for you to write a biography to change people's perception of King George?
Well, for the previous 2 centuries, he's had the most terrible historical reputation, partly this is down to the Declaration of Independence, which of course said that he was unfit to be the ruler of the free people, which is completely wrong. He was the ruler of Britain, and we were a free people at the time. And there are 28 clauses in the Declaration of Independence, 26 of which are basically attacking their ad hominem attacks on George III. 26 of them are wrong and untrue and don't hold water. But the two that are accurate, the one about the 17th, which is about taxation, and the 22nd, which is about Parliament's veto rights over American legislation, in and of themselves do justify the American Revolution. So, the revolution, it was right that the revolution took place, but the revolutionaries needed to clothe themselves in the mantle of the previous revolutionaries of 1642 against Charles I and 1688 against James II. And the way they did that was to try to portray George III as a sort of Stuart absolutist monarch, which he absolutely was not. He was a limited monarch who, as I mentioned, revered the Constitution of 1688.
Do you feel like the founders had to add those clauses in the Declaration to make the point to the people to revolt, or those 2 points about taxation and
Well, it would have been a very short declaration, wouldn't it? If you had the prologue bit, which is beautiful. In those opening remarks of those first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence are sublime. It's Shakespearean prose. It's wonderful stuff. But after that, you have these 28 clauses, which are frankly rubbish. There's a combination of ex post facto rationalization there. He's blamed for things that every monarch since Elizabeth I had done, and then he's blamed for some things which are completely invented. He's blamed for taking Americans abroad across the oceans for trial. Not a single American in the whole reign of George III was ever taken across the oceans for trial. So, it really has taken 200 years for him to be rehabilitated. We know what tyrants were like in the 18th century. People like Catherine the Great, who slaughtered 50,000 people after the Pugachev uprising, or what the French were doing in Corsica, what the Spanish did when they put down the rising in New Orleans, executing all of the ringleaders. George III was not like that. He didn't close a single American newspaper. He never arrested an American editor. He never tried to stop the Stamp Act Congress or the First Continental Congress from meeting. There is simply no way that he can be mistaken any longer now, 200 years later, for a tyrant, because of a declaration that was frankly a wartime propaganda document.
Mm-hmm. And did the founders themselves, when writing these different clauses that you are saying are false, believe what they were writing, or were they just writing it as kind of filler?
Well, they were, yeah. I mean, lots of them were lawyers, of course, including Thomas Jefferson. And lawyers do have a tendency to what's called pad their briefs, which is to stick any argument in there that might, just chuck as much mud as possible in the hope that, a lot of it will stick. Mm-hmm. The two pieces of mud that I mentioned that they threw justified the revolution. The other 26. Frankly, I mean, I go into this, of course, in chapter 13 of my book, and so any reader will be able to spot the extraordinary calumnies against that just weren't supported in reality.
Mm-hmm. And how did the British view the war that was being fought 3,000 miles away? How did the people view it, and how did the politicians view it? Were they in support? Were they against it?
It very much depended on who you were. There was a difference within the cities, which were more pro-American. The towns, the cities were pro-American. The countryside less so. Anglicans were more pro the government, whereas dissenters and Scots, for example, and Irish tended to be more pro-American. The richer you were, the more likely you were to be pro the establishment, and the poorer you were on occasion. Not this isn't true across the board. Um, it changed from county to county, the popularity of the war. And then the popularity of the war changes very, very suddenly in February 1778, when overall the war has been relatively unpopular, and it's been difficult to find troops to go and fight in it. And then when the French get involved, and we're at war with Britain's at war with France, it suddenly becomes a quite popular war, because wars against France have been popular for 400 years, before that, and nothing was going to change there. So at that point, you do get a lot of people joining the colours and going off to fight. But the drawback is, of course, by that stage, especially after the Spanish get involved in 1779 and the Dutch declare war on Britain in 1780, that the whole war has turned from being a colonial conflict into being a global conflict, where Britain is having to fight in the East Indies, in Africa, in the Mediterranean. Gibraltar is put under a 1,000-day siege, in the West Indies. And so actually the opportunity for offensive measures in any theatre of the war in America completely closes down essentially once the French get involved in 1778. You get one or two. I mean, Charleston, of course, is captured in 1780, but beyond that, and beyond Cornwallis's movement towards the Yorktown Peninsula, there's very little going on, frankly, in a big sense in that war.
Yeah, I don't know if you like to deal in what ifs or historical what ifs.
Love them. I once wrote a book called What Might Have Been, or at least I edited the book called What Might Have Been and wrote a chapter of it. I've written lots of chapters on what might have been. The wonderful thing about counterfactual history from the point of view of the historian is you don't have to do any research.
How about if the French never got involved in the American Revolution, what would have happened, do you think?
Well, I think by that stage, of course, the Germain Plan, which was Britain's major plan, had failed, because the plan basically was to get Sir William Howe to come up from New York, up the Hudson Valley, at the same time that Sir John Burgoyne came down south from Canada, and they were going to meet at Albany, and the possession of the Hudson Valley essentially was going to cut the New England colonies off from the rest of the 13 colonies. So you got, that was the British plan for victory. That had already collapsed in the October of 1777, when because William Howe veered off eastwards and captured Philadelphia, Sir John Burgoyne got captured at Saratoga in the October of that year. So it had already, the major part of the British plan had already failed. Much more interesting, I think, if we're going to do what ifs, is what if Bunker Hill had gone differently and wasn't the Pyrrhic victory that it was for Britain? What if Howe had managed to capture the Continental Army as it was trying to exit Manhattan? What if you hadn't had the extraordinary charismatic leadership of George Washington at Valley Forge, and the American army had simply sort of vanished away because of the terrible deprivations there over that freezing winter. So there are ways in which, in fact, it's interesting when the American War of Independence is war gamed by at tournament level by war gamers, Britain wins 45% of the time. But I think by the time the French get involved, it's, as I say, it's pretty much a done deal for America to become an independent country in some way. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of when I was reading your book, what I found is a lot of how I was taught about the War of Independence in the United States was evil King George, as you mentioned, and evil taxes being levied on tea and sugar, I believe, right? So tea and sugar, and then what's interesting is you
And rum and stamps.
and
I mean, yes, there were
yeah,
lots of things.
you mentioned that with tea and sugar, that the majority of the taxes were actually paid by a certain group of people that weren't the majority of the population. It was lawyers and journalists. Um, why was that important to shaping how people thought about the conflict
Well,
with
the lawyers and the journalists. I mean, that was actually the Stamp Act, much more
Stamp
than
Acts?
anything to
Right.
do with
Mm.
tea. I mean, tea was basically that was levied on anyone who drank tea. But in fact, the what the Boston Tea Party was all about was to destroy the cheap tea that was being flooded in from the East India Company. Actually, the American consumer was going to get much cheaper tea. Um, and even the taxed version was going to be a lot cheaper than the smuggled stuff.
Mm.
Um, but with regard to the lawyers and the journalists, well, they're the most um, vocal parts of society. They're the most eloquent parts of society. They can and have throughout history caused an awful lot more trouble than almost any other two sets of professions. There's an old line from the 19th century that you shouldn't make enemies of people who buy ink by the barrow load. Barrel load. And there's a lot to be said for that. The Stamp Act did fall on the most on the loudest people. And also, the other thing to remember about it is that it was only intended to raise 40 to 60,000 pounds from a population of 2.5 million, 1.9 unenslaved million people, which was a tiny amount. It's only about 2 shillings and sixpence per American per year, an absolutely tiny amount, and every penny of it was going to be spent in America, protecting the 13 colonies. So it was a much misunderstood act, and of course George III was instrumental in making sure that it was repealed.
Mhm. What did the British think the purpose of what the colonies were trying to accomplish? Oh, what did they think of this whole endeavor?
They hoped that it was going to be part of a massive English-speaking empire that was going to girdle the world, and which would be part of what was going on, part and parcel of what was going on in the West Indies and in Africa, and certainly in the East Indies, and actually was going to be a Canada, of course, also um, a huge sort of Anglo sphere, an empire that spoke English and was strong enough to, through its sheer size, to um, trade within itself and ultimately be a great force for peace, because obviously no foreign empire would ever have the temerity to go to war against it. And I think that's true, by the way. If you want a counterfactual, what if the American War of Independence hadn't taken place, and that what became the American Republic and the British Empire were the same political entity in 1914? There is simply no way that the Kaiser would have invaded Belgium and gone to war with France. It couldn't have done that if the United States had been part of a great sort of English-speaking peoples. And so you wouldn't have got the Bolshevik Revolution, you wouldn't have got the Nazis, you wouldn't have got the Holocaust.
That's a persuasive argument as to why we should have stayed part of the British Empire.
Thank you, Stanley.
um,
Well, I mean, history never works like that, does it? But
yeah.
nonetheless, I think it's important to remember with history that there is no prearranged historical outcome. That human interaction is such that it doesn't it bifurcates constantly, the way that the world goes. Every one of us has the power of independent sovereign thought and action, and therefore, of course, it means we're much more responsible. However, the Marxists and the determinists are wrong, because mankind is not going in any set direction. And so also the Whig historians, the people who attacked George III, who assumed that mankind was becoming more progressive all the time and getting better and better. And that that argument is one that just simply does not survive Auschwitz.
That's an interesting point. And to that point, do you think that there's I've had different people on the podcast making different arguments about this, but what do you think? Is it important to um, just know history, or is it important to also apply it to the current day? And is it possible to apply it to current events?
Yes, I think it is. I think my friend Neil Ferguson has got an outfit entitled Applied History.
Mm.
And in fact, I've got a podcast that's about to start, and I'm going to be interviewing him on that. And I think it's a fascinating subject. The problem is, of course, you know, that no two things happen exactly similarly, and so you mustn't mistake something that happened in the past for something that's going to happen in the future. So that's why you need to study history. Winston Churchill was asked by a young American, a chap not unadjacent to your age, I suspect, in the Westminster Hall on the coronation day in 1953. This young American came up and asked him for some life advice. And Churchill said, study history, for therein lies all the secrets of statecraft. And I think that's right. But you obviously mustn't either study the wrong history or study the right history wrongly, or take the lessons of history to be precisely the same situation as in earlier times. You see, there's a classic example of this is the Suez Crisis in 1956, where Anthony Eden, who had been involved in the appeasement years, equated General Nasser of Egypt with Mussolini and Hitler, which clearly he was not. You know, there's a huge difference between being an Arab nationalist and being a Nazi or a fascist. So you mustn't sort of misapply the lessons of history.
Mhm. And to take that Churchill statement a little further, has that lesson been lost on us in some ways? Because it seems maybe it's because we live in the current day and it's hard to objectively observe the world as you're living in it. But have people just become more or less historically illiterate? And could that be attributed? Could that be one of the reasons why we have some of the problems we have today?
I must. I don't know about the American situation. I'm not. I'm not an American. I don't have any special insight into the teaching of history in America. But there is a problem with it in Britain, undoubtedly. Dates are almost never taught, whereas they're the absolute essential building blocks of understanding a chronology, a narrative of a nation. The problems that we have also with essentially wokery and political correctness, where we impose modern day values on everybody in the past and judge them according to our obsessions of the day. Frankly, doesn't really sort of shine much light into the actions and the people of the past. I'm afraid there is a tremendous ignorance about America and American history in Britain. We had I can't remember how many thousand school children. There was a significant sample, certainly a sort of, where it would be accepted as a sort of market sample, who were asked who won the American War of Independence, and they answered Denzel Washington. Or at least 20% of them did, and so it does rather. Well, I know it's bizarre and worrying. Although 20% of them also thought that Winston Churchill was a fictional character. So, I do think that there's a huge opportunity to teach people more.
What's interesting is I was actually talking to a friend of mine recently, and I mentioned we were talking about something. I was like, and I brought up a Churchill line, and at the end, he looked dumbfounded. He liked the quote, but he goes, "Who's Winston Churchill?" And my heart, and this man is close to 30 years old, and my heart sank to my stomach, And I was like, I couldn't believe that somebody didn't know who Winston Churchill was.
In order to learn the lessons of history, as Churchill, told us that we must try, you've got to know some history in the first place, haven't you? And if you haven't heard of Winston Churchill, you've got to the age of 30, then I think your teachers ought to be publicly arraigned and indicted, frankly.
Um, and I think more to the point of how we teach history, and in the United States, we have similar problems to what you just described. In the UK, where a third of people polls, in various polls, couldn't name the three branches of government. They couldn't. They thought that Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass were contemporaries. Things like that, and people confused the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. And
yeah, I mean, of course, it's a wonderful opportunity for freelance writers like myself. If the academy has failed so dismally, schools have failed so dismally, then it does mean that people like me are able to write books. Your 30-year-old friend, for example, ought to be buying my book, Churchill Walking with Destiny, and teaching himself. I mean, in a way, it's a rather exciting thing. Imagine at the age of 30, suddenly to discover for the first time this extraordinary individual called Winston Churchill. He must always feel that no creature could exist like this, who was such an extraordinary figure in so many ways. I mean, it must be quite exciting to be as ignorant as that and have the world in front of you, able to learn so much about it. It'd be like suddenly discovering a new planet.
yeah, and I think the other thing I would mention is that oftentimes I've encountered numerous people that went through school and they used to tell me the same line. They said, history is boring. And I would always respond by saying, well, you never had a teacher that taught it the right way. And maybe I'm wrong in that observation, but
yeah, no, you're right. It's history is the most exciting subject. It's the most fun. If it's taught properly, it is totally engrossing. It's obviously something that I spend my life doing. So, and I would never dedicate my life to something that I found boring. It's a total delight. Every day brings something new. So anyone who says that history is boring has been taught it criminally badly.
Yeah, I remember American historian David McCullough once mentioned that he thinks it's a little concerning that history is taught not that it's not taught chronologically. Well, one, it's not taught chronologically in schools, but two, that it's taught as a collection of dates and provisos and all this without actually making it fun. And I think what's incredible about your books and about, you mentioned Neil Ferguson's books and David McCullough's and Ron Chernow's, all these great historians, is that you're almost reading a work of fiction. It's a story. Yes, but the only difference is that there are a lot of facts and actual quotes in those books that teach you about a person that actually existed, and you try to
that's
model.
why it's much more fun than I mean, it's stranger than fiction and much more fun than fiction, as far as I'm concerned, because it did happen, and you're right. And David and Ron and Neil and those people that you mentioned, who all of whom I know and all of whom I respect enormously, are attempting to put flesh on the bones of the dates. But boy, do you need the dates, because if you don't know that something in the 17th century happened before something in the 18th century, then it is impossible to work out what people were thinking and what they were assuming and what their background assumptions were. And so, I'm a great believer in dates, but as you say, they mustn't just be rammed down your throat. They've got to be explained.
Yeah. Once I listened to a interview with Walter Isaacson, great biographer, Steve Jobs, Da Vinci, and etc. And
Ben Franklin, I think.
Ben Franklin, yes. And he grew up in New Orleans, and I forgot who told him this. I think one of his professors said, in New Orleans, you can either be a storyteller or a pastor. So please, Walter, become a storyteller. We have too many pastors. And I think that's what makes a great historian stand out among, sometimes overly academic historians, where you're reading a story. And I'm just curious, as a person that writes popular nonfiction biographies and books, where did you learn to write nonfiction as a story, and how did you learn it?
Well, I was very fortunate. I was taught by some very good teachers at school. There was a man called Christopher Perry when I was about 10 years old, who was a charismatic history teacher, and he excited me in the subject. When I was at Cambridge University, I was taught by Professor Norman Stone, who was another highly charismatic figure and a great writer. And they very much um, basically taught me that there's no point in just writing dry as dust academic books that no one reads. If you want to actually have an influence, then you must make sure that you're speaking to a wide and interested audience. I mean, that's not to say that I don't lecture at universities. I do. I'm connected to various universities, and I'm very thankful to them. But I've never had to mark exam papers or actually one occasion on Cornell I did, but yeah, you know what you can do, and now I'm in my 50s, late 50s, almost 60s. I'm an old dog who can't really learn new tricks, so so you sort of play to your strengths pretty much.
Yeah. Also, speaking of Neil Ferguson earlier on, I just thought of, I remember he was on a podcast with Lex Friedman, a great podcast host, very popular man.
Yes, I've heard of him. Yeah.
He and he asked Neil Ferguson like what his plans are for the future. What is his like next book going to be about? And I know he plans to finish his uh, second volume about Henry Kissinger. But then he said something that hit me pretty hard, and he said that's probably going to be my last, because he thinks that the medium of people buying books and reading them is dying, or not as many people are interested in that particular medium. I'm sure he'll figure out some creative way to bring history to people, through documentaries or whatever. But I saw that as one, startling that one of the premier historians in the world would say that, and the second is that I found it deeply saddening that he would say something like
Well,
that.
gosh, first of all, I had no idea that was the way he was feeling. Secondly, uh, as I say, I'm going to be interviewing him for my podcast in a few weeks' time, and so that's something that I'll definitely bring up, because that would be a tragic thing. I mean, Neil is a superb historian. The number of I think I've read all of his books, and there have been a lot of them, and they've been really first class. In fact, I reviewed the Henry Kissinger Volume
Mhm.
One, and the idea that he's going to give up writing history books, maybe he was, I don't know, trying to shock Lex. Maybe he was trying to make some point that he hadn't thought through properly. Because I can't believe that Kissinger's going to be the last book of a man who is, well, he's younger than me for certain, and obviously at the top of his game. You've depressed me intensely, Stanley. Thank you very much. I was looking forward to coming on this podcast and having a very interesting conversation about history, but I had no idea that a great friend of mine was about to throw in the towel because because the whole of history doesn't sort of work for people any longer. That's a truly tragic thing to hear. I'm not sure he's right, by the way. 500,000 people have bought my biography of Churchill, which in 18 languages in all its various forms, of course, but nonetheless, it's still a very significant number of people who one can interact with and hopefully persuade that that there is sort of hope for the world. But it's a perplexing thing if somebody as intelligent and driven and talented as Neil is essentially going to sort of leave the book writing profession.
Yeah. Also, what fascinates me about people like you and Neil is, um, what we don't always get to see as consumers of your books is your writing process. What goes into um, writing these books? Like, we see the finished product, but we don't know all the drafts and all the research that definitely goes into it.
You don't want to
And
know. You don't want to know. The 500,000 or so words of my Napoleon book came out of over 10 million words of notes that I took for it. So it's a huge labour of love. That was my fifth book on Churchill, and over 30 years. So you can imagine that's a sort of half a lifetime spent on it. And then other ones, like my biography of Napoleon, took 6 years, and I visited 53 of Napoleon's 60 battlefields in 10 countries. And so, the work involved is, you're thinking about it all the time from the moment you wake up, really. Even when you're sort of trying to relax on holiday, you're always in the back of your mind, you're thinking, now that chapter 21, it's not really working at the moment. I'm going to have to work. What should I do? So yes, it's a great intellectual exercise. But that is, I think, one of the things that keeps you enjoying life. At least I hope so.
but I'm gonna try to prod a little bit and then ask what I'm truly fascinated. People, I think, this is an audio podcast, but they will see a book like this, 700 pages, 900 pages, and so well written about these fascinating characters of history, and think, how does a person go from one piece of paper to writing 700 pages about any given subject? What does your day to day look like?
Well, it's not so much my day to day as my subject's day to day. You do work out what he was doing, where he was, what was sort of he was saying, for as many days of his life as you think are important. So with Churchill, you start on the day he was born and end with the day he dies. You've got a chronology that says who, what, why, when, where, which is what the questions that everybody wants the answers to. You then break it down into different files. So you'll have Churchill and religion, Churchill and the Bengal famine, Churchill and the First World War, Churchill and the invention of the tank or whatever. And you will then, the key thing is because you want to keep the reader working along with you, is to insert those files into the key place where the chronology stops, and you delve deep into an aspect of the subject's life that you think is important. You've got to make sure there are lots of jokes there. That's not a problem, obviously, with Churchill, because he made so many. But with other people I've written about, if they haven't got much of a sense of humour, you've got to keep the reader amused by sticking in the sort of best gags of the 18th century, as it were, which again is important. You don't want to bog readers down with too many statistics, but equally you've got to use them in order to amplify what you're trying to say. Quotations are always invaluable because it brings you immediately to the reader, immediately gets into the mind of your subject. So, there are all sorts of pretty straightforward, frankly, tricks of the trade that every writer uses, and that's part of the pleasure of it. That's part of the art of it, at least.
Do you wake up at, I know there are people that everyone has their different ways of doing it. Some people are night owls, some people are morning people. Do you wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, or do you wake up at 10 o'clock in the after? Not
I'm
afternoon, but
usually at work by 4:30 a.m. Most
wow.
days, and then it's a weird thing that I started when I was at university, and it's sort of kept on. I take a Churchillian nap for 45 minutes every afternoon of my life, and have done for the last 30 plus years. And I try not to work after about 6:30 in the evening at all, any evening ever. So yes, I've got a sort of mad thing. It's probably very bad for my health, um, but it tends to work. And after doing it for a few years, you're a young man, but when you find if you do this for a few years, your body gets totally used to it, and you get into the system to the point that you have to continue that way.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, there's a famous Navy SEAL on YouTube named Jocko Willick, and every day he posts a photo on his social media of a watch at 4 o'clock in the morning. That's when he wakes up because that's what he was used to in the SEALs, and that's his way of doing. And I tried it for a few days, and I couldn't stand it. And I'm
Well,
a morning
you
person too,
say
but 4 o'clock
you
is.
say that, yeah, but the thing is about that time is that you can do 5 hours work before anybody bothers you. Before anybody else is
Mhm.
around, you've basically got a 5 hour jump on everybody, and all it costs you is the 45-minute nap in the afternoon.
Mhm. Well, I think I might have to try it, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a few. I have a few more questions that I really want to ask, and I think your last book before King George was called Leadership in War, where you talked about a few leaders in history and some of the lessons we can get from them. What was the one question I really wanted to ask about that book is that you focused on not just the quote unquote the good ones, the Churchills of the world, but you focused on Stalin and Hitler in that book as well, which is fascinating. What do you think we have to learn from the evil leaders of history as well as the good ones?
Well, I think the point I was trying to make really is that leadership is it's always sort of thought of as not necessarily a good thing, but it's not really. It's like nuclear fission. It can be used for evil just as much as for good. It's like the ocean. It doesn't have a moral stance. You can have charismatic leadership, which leads people to utter destruction, as the Adolf Hitler, who you mentioned earlier, obviously proved with the German people. Um, I think it's important in both of those cases, to look at various aspects of them, which I did in that essay. The first was with Stalin, to remember how important the concepts of Marxist Leninism were to him. People like to draw out the fact that he was a Russian nationalist leader, which of course he was in the war, but a lot of his thinking really was ideologically Bolshevik. And he really did believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat and so on. And the sheer number of innocent people who he massacred um, did not just come as a result of paranoia and a sort of sinister personality trait, although he certainly undoubtedly had those, but also because he did believe that he was making the world a better place by killing these people. So I think that's a very interesting and important aspect of Marxism, Leninism, and Stalin. Um, the other thing with regard to Hitler was quite how weird he was. His beliefs were, of course, the racial ones that we rightly find so disgusting today are important, but they're not the only ones. He also believed um, that he knew what dogs were thinking. He had very weird views about English lawns. He had sort of horrible theories about the role of women in society. He was a fanatic on so many other planes, because we know what he thought. He sat down most evenings at the Berchtesgaden, and the Nazi Party secretary Martin Bormann took down everything that he said, and people very rarely interrupted Adolf Hitler when he was on one of his sort of long rodomontades, and he would just chat away to essentially to himself, really, and come up with these incredibly weird ideas that Franklin Roosevelt was Jewish, or that people wore Czechoslovakian people had moustaches that came from Mongolia, or you could cure beriberi by eating potatoes. It's just so. So what I decided to do in that chapter in Leadership in War was just to sort of essentially put the racial, anti-Semitic, foul bacillus to one side, and to tell people about all the other completely nutty. He believed that there was a society that lived in the sort of pre-Stone Age that left axe heads and so on in places in order to sort of con later civilizations into thinking that they weren't more advanced than they were. I mean, this is all absolutely, it's the kind of thing that conspiracy theorists have today, and really it sort of boxes him in to a group of people who shouldn't have been allowed a million miles towards power, executive power in a modern country, and so I hope that is a classic example of a warning, of a warning from history, essentially.
I wrap up all my podcasts very quickly with 2 questions that I ask everybody, and I'm going to put them together, and you can answer them in whatever order you please. The first one is, if you have any, I hope you do, what gives you hope for the future? And the second question is, what are 5 books, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend to people on any topic?
Oh, wow. Okay, well, what gives me hope for the future? Young people I meet. That's easy. I find my children give me hope for a good and positive future for my country. I mean, it might sound cheesy, but people like you doing podcasts and being interested and learning history, and I can see behind you a huge bookshelf it looks like absolutely packed with books and papers. That kind of thing makes me happy to see. 5 books, gosh, you should have given me a chance with that. I don't know what I'd say. Let me think. If you're interested in biography, there's a superb biography of King George V written by Kenneth Rose. There's Talleyrand, which I think which was written by Alfred Duff Cooper in the 1930s, which I think is one of the greatest history books ever. I've just been rereading Robert Strassler's Thucydides, the landmark Thucydides that Victor Davis Hanson writes the introduction for, and that's really excellent. Since we mentioned Neil Ferguson, I think the first volume of Kissinger was superb, and I'm really looking forward to the second volume. That's a kind of exciting moment for me when that comes out. I will pounce on it, hopefully review it, because I do a lot of book reviewing. I review 100 books or so a year, and it's a great thing to be able to be paid to read books that you were going to read anyway.
Yeah.
So I love that. I don't know how many I'm up to. I think I've done 4. Shall I do another one? Let's think. What have I got on my? Well, my next book is a biography of Disraeli, and so as I'm allowed fiction in your list, I'm going to tell you about some of his 13 novels. I'm taking 2 of them on holiday, including one called The Young Duke, which I'm halfway through, which is he wrote when he was 26, and it's possibly even younger, and it's great. It's fun. It's got lots of aperçus and lots of witticisms and lots of sort of English high irony, and so I'd recommend that. So, all in all, thank you for suddenly chucking that one at me. But I think any of those 5 books that I mentioned would be great fun for anybody to read.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that this is an honor and a privilege to have you on the podcast. I thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Hopefully one day we'll get to meet in person and do it again.
Thank you very much indeed, Stanley. I've much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Goodbye.